It's quiet and peaceful now, but between 1939 and 1945, it was a very different story. And it's difficult to imagine standing here today that if this site had never existed, there are probably tens of thousands of servicemen and women who might never have made it through to the end of World War II. And there are countless numbers of people alive today who, when you think about it, might never even have been born. And that's quite a sobering thought. Welcome to Bletchley Park, the wartime home of the codebreakers. This is the mansion here at Bletchley Park. But when Sir Herbert Lyon and his wife moved in 1883, it was little more than a red brick farmhouse. But over the years, they expanded it outwards and upwards until we see the mansion as it is today. Sir Herbert died in 1926 and his wife in 1937. After that, the entire estate was broken up for redevelopment and sold off. And the mansion and the surrounding 55 acres were eventually purchased by Admiral Sir Hugh Sinclair, who was the head of SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service. He also had links to GC&CS, the Government Code and Cypher School, or as it was known by the employees, the Golf, Cheese and Chess Society. Admiral Sinclair had been watching Europe very carefully. He'd seen the rise of Nazism, he'd seen the rise of Hitler, and I think he was convinced in his bones that World War II was pretty much on the cards. And if that happened, what he wanted to do was move the headquarters of GC&CS out of London to a safe and secure location. And how much safe and secure can you get with a country estate buried in the depths of Buckinghamshire? He was proved to be correct. And just before war was declared, the first intake of codebreakers moved into the mansion here in August 1939. And one of the very first that moved in was probably one of the most famous, Alan Turing. When the codebreakers moved into the mansion, there was approximately 100 of them. And they took over all of the ground floor rooms, the ballroom, the music room, the library, anywhere where they could set up tables and chairs to work. In fact, visitors here to the mansion now can see on the walls behind me very brief biographies of the most famous people that worked here. People like John Tiltman, Max Newman, Mavis Beatty, Peter Twin, Bill Tutt, Turing himself, many, many others. And it didn't take long to get the huts built, which they needed around the site. But the problem was that the building on the huts wasn't keeping up with the number of staff that were coming in. And soon the ground floor was full. They couldn't move upstairs because MI6 had taken over the upper floors. So the only place they could go was outwards. And the only place they could spread to was the garage. This is the rear of the mansion, and this was Sir Herbert's garage. And in here he kept his 2 horse-drawn landaus, very splendid in those days. But Sir Herbert was a very rich man, and when the age of the motor car came, he decided to buy himself a couple of Rolls Royces. Well, you don't think he'd actually buy 2 Model T Fords now, do you? This is the inside of Sir Herbert's garage, and in his time it was a very nice wood-panelled building, quite luxurious considering the fact that he only had cars in here. But when the codebreakers outgrew the mansion, they had to come in here, and that's when they took over the gallery that you can see running along the top. I have to apologise for the scaffolding, but a certain amount of refurbishment work has just been started, and I think they've started it on the very day we started filming. These days the garage is used by a local model boat club, and they make all of these fantastic models. And if you come down to Bletchley Park in the summer, you'll actually see some of these sailing on the lake, and what a fantastic sight it makes. During the war, this was one of the main entrances into the park. The gates were a little bit nearer to us than they are now, but you can still see the two brick-built sentry boxes that were on either side, and they were manned by armed guards 24/7. Everybody who worked at the park had to have identification, and they had to sign the Official Secrets Act. In fact, it's strange to think that there were men and women who came here to work at the park. They met, they married, but they never talked to each other about what they did. They really didn't know. And I think in those days they probably thought that if they did talk, they'd be carted off and incarcerated into the Tower of London for the duration. In fact, Winston Churchill, whenever he mentioned Bletchley Park, never spoke of it by name. Not in any of his memos, his reports, his letters, nothing. He always referred to it as my most secret source. And the people here that worked at the park, he described as the geese that laid the golden eggs, that never cattled. And they never did, not for the best part of 40 years. This was also one of the main entrances for the dispatch riders. And they used to bring messages in from our Y stations. The Y stations were listening stations that we had all down the east, the southeast and the south coast of Britain. And they were listening into the airwaves, listening for messages put out from the continent in Morse. And they would take these messages down very, very accurately, and then they would give them to the dispatch riders. The riders would come in here, into the park, and then the messages were disseminated around all the various code breakers. Bletchley Park was so secret that it was only ever bombed once during the war, and that was in November 1940. We think that it was a bomber either aiming for the railway lines about 500-600 yards in that direction and missed, or he'd completely lost his way and thought to himself, to heck with this for a game of soldiers, I'm going home. And he did. He turned his plane around, dropped his bombs. One stick of bombs landed over in the churchyard, did no damage at all. One bomb landed over in the south of the park, slightly damaged a couple of buildings, but the third bomb landed just beyond these trees here. It buried itself in the soft earth before it exploded. Now at this time, hut number 4, just to the side of the mansion, had actually been built, and there were people working in it. The bomb itself didn't do any damage, but the blast moved hut number 4 about a metre off its foundations. So when the hut had stopped moving and the dust had settled, we have it on record that one of the ladies who was working in the hut turned to one of her colleagues and uttered those immortal words, "Did you feel the earth move?" Bletchley Park was also known as Station X, and in the next part we'll find out how it got its name and where the first breakthrough in Enigma here at the park was made. What you're looking at now is the square tower, which in Sir Herbert's time was a water tower. But when the code breakers moved in here, 2 MI6 officers moved into that tower with radio equipment, and their job was to keep in touch with our embassies in Stockholm, Helsinki up in the north, down to Tunis in North Africa in the south, and as far east as Istanbul. But this wasn't a Y station, it wasn't a listening station. This was designated as an X station, or Station X. X being the Roman numeral for 10, because it was the 10th such station set up by the government. When everything about Bletchley Park came out into the public domain, Station X became the generic name by which the whole of Bletchley Park was known, and still is today. But the code breakers, they outgrew the mansion, they outgrew the garage, they had to move somewhere else. The next place they moved to was the stable yard. This is the stable yard, and the building behind me in Sir Herbert's time was his fruit store, and all of the soft fruit from the estate came into this building. But during the war it was taken over by the code breakers, and Alan Turing and one or two more moved into here after they outgrew the mansion and the garage. The building behind me was the tack and feed store during Sir Herbert's time, where everything for the horses was kept. But when the code breakers moved in, it was split into cottages. Cottage number 1 behind me was kept for meetings. Cottage number 2 housed the only family that ever lived here at the park, and that was the Budd family, Robert and Emma. Robert had worked here at the park before war started, and he was kept on, although neither of them had anything to do with code breaking work. But cottage number 3, at the end, that's where the story really started. During World War I, most of the British cryptanalysts worked out of room 40 in the Admiralty building. And one of the most famous codebreakers there was Dilwyn Knox, or as he was known, Dilly Knox. So it made sense that when World War II started, he would come here to the park. And he did. And he worked here in cottage number 3, together with a very small team. And thanks to information that we got from the Polish cryptanalysts in Warsaw, plus the work that Dilly Knox had already done on Enigma, he actually managed to make the first breakthrough in Enigma messages here at the park in January 1940. We're now actually standing outside hut number 8, which is the only hut up to now that has been fully renovated and refurbished. Many of the huts work together. We had hut number 4 over by the mansion, and that held the intelligence staff that were working on the German naval decrypts. But in hut number 8 we had the code breakers who were actually breaking the naval codes, and this was Alan Turing's hut. So now we'll go through and see where the great man himself worked. Alan Turing's office, this way. Round here to Alan Turing's office. This is the office where Alan Turing worked here in Hut 8 during the Second World War. There are very few photographs that tell us anything about how the office really looked, but the way that it's laid out now we think is more or less how it would have looked. Fairly Spartan in those days: a chair, a desk, a bookcase, and of course a place for the gas mask. Turing was an eccentric character, certainly. A genius at mathematics and computing he certainly was. But it's often been said that he probably suffered from Asperger's syndrome, which is a high-end form of autism. Although it was never officially diagnosed, his behaviour tended to indicate that that may well have been a problem for him. It's also been said that Sir Isaac Newton may well have suffered from the same problem, but contrary to popular belief, I wasn't around in his day, so I couldn't vouch for that. He always used to come to work in a suit and tie, but it was often said that his suits and dry cleaners had never been introduced to each other. He suffered from hay fever, but instead of taking medication and staying indoors in the spring and summer, he used to ride around on this clapped-out bicycle with a gas mask on. And his bike was so bad that the chain kept falling off it. But Turing, being Turing, worked out that if he counted the number of revolutions of the wheels, he would get to a point where, if he backpedaled, the chain wouldn't fall off. I think probably only Turing could figure that one out. He had no sense of humour. If anybody cracked a joke, he would smile politely, but that was about it. But as far as his bike was concerned, and various other things, he was almost paranoid about getting things stolen. Somebody once said to him, "Why don't you get your bike fixed?" He said, "Why should I? Who's going to steal that wreck?" And that even came down to his tea mug. Because what he did was he chained it to the radiator, just to make sure it didn't disappear. And when he walked from here, from his office, over to the canteen for his meals, he always used to walk with his head down. He didn't like making eye contact with people because he thought if they did, they would draw him into conversation. And Turing never really liked conversing with people whom he thought were intellectually inferior to himself. I can't really blame him for that, can you? We've just moved round the corner from hut number 8, and behind me are two of the other huts that were very important during World War II. The one on my left with the blue tarpaulin, that was Gordon Welshman's hut, and he and his team were responsible for decoding the Army and the Air Force Enigma messages. Hut number 3, which was the red hut behind me, that held the intelligence staff who acted on those decrypts. One of the reasons why they're in such a sad condition is that since the Bletchley Park Trust was formed in 1992, we've never had any government funding. But recently, more funding has come in. We've had funding from English Heritage, we've had funding from the local council, Milton Keynes, and we've just heard that we've also had some funding through from the Heritage Lottery Fund. And if we add all of that up together, plus the funding that we might be getting in the future, it still falls very short of the £10 million that we need here to turn this into a world-class educational centre and a World Heritage Site. But that's another story. We've talked a lot up to now about Enigma, so I think now's the time that we actually ought to go and look at one. This is the Enigma machine, and in the next part we'll be looking at how this worked and how the mistakes that the Germans made actually helped the code breakers here to crack it. This is the Enigma machine. It was invented in 1918 by Arthur Scherbius in Germany, and he'd originally invented it for the commercial and banking world, and his original design didn't include the plug board, and it only had 3 rotors. It was never a great commercial success, but it was taken over in 1928 by the Reichsmarine, which was the forerunner of the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. They started using it, and when Hitler came to power, he saw it, liked it, and decided that the entire German military should use it. So, what are the various components of it? We have the plug board on the front. This has got 26 letters of the alphabet, and by each letter there's a socket. The machine was supplied with 10 cables. Each cable had a plug on each end, so 10 pairs of letters could be bridged or steckered together. Steckered because this was known as the Steckerbrett. Behind that there's the keyboard, laid out very, very similar to today's QWERTY keyboards. But instead of QWERTY, we had TZ on the machine because Z was a very common letter in the German language. Behind that is an illuminated panel of 26 letters, and each letter can be lit from underneath with a small bulb. And at the back, that's where the real heart of the machine is. If we open the cover, the first thing that strikes us is that it was fairly obvious that the Germans during the war were not using Duracell Plus batteries. They had their own built-in battery. We have the 3 rotors here. We have on the right of the rotors what was called the entry disc, and on the left was called the reflector, which did exactly what it said on the tin. But to appreciate the complications of Enigma, we have to appreciate how these rotors are wired. And to do that, we'll just take them out. Round each rotor there's a ring which has the 26 letters of the alphabet, and this ring was capable of being moved completely independent of the internal wiring. There were 26 contacts on one side, 26 on the other, and the contacts were wired across to each other, but always differentially. In other words, the contact by S might be wired across to A, the contact by T might be wired across to J, and so on. No contact on this side was ever wired directly across to its mate on the other side.
and each of the 3 rotors was wired differently, as was the entry disc. So if we pop these back, you'll be able to see how it works. Once Enigma was set up, the operator could then begin to send the messages. Each one of the keys was connected mechanically to the fast rotor. We had the fast, the middle and the slow. And half pressure on a key moved the rotor round 1 letter, and full pressure generated the signal which went through the machine and lit up one of the lights on top. So if we close the cover, we'll be able to see exactly what happened. If we press Y, the rotor will go round and K lights up. If we press X, the rotor goes round again and F lights up. The signal was going from the keys down into the plug board. It went into the plug board at one point, came out at a totally different point, and then went up to the entry disc. It went into the entry disc at one point, and because of the wiring, came out at a totally different point, and then went through the rotors via the very circuitous wiring inside of those. It then went into the reflector, which turned around or reflected the signal back through the rotors via a different route to where it went in the first time. It therefore went through the entry disc at a different point to where it came out the first time, and it came out at a different point to where it went in. It then went back down to the plug board at a different point to where it came out the first time, and it came out at a different point to where it went in and lit up a light on top. I hope you're still with me. So we can see that if we press Y, T lights up. If we press X, P lights up. If we press C, K lights up. If we press C again, L lights up. Enigma was arranged that no letter in the original message ever coded itself as itself in the final message, and no matter how many times you hit a key, you would never get the same light coming up twice. Now, the Germans thought that this was Enigma's biggest strength. But if you had a coded message, and you knew, as British intelligence knew, that no letter in that coded message represented itself in the original plaintext message, what have you done? Well, you've completely eliminated one variable out of the equation. So that means that that wasn't Enigma's biggest strength, it was actually Enigma's biggest weakness. And that, together with the mistakes that the German operators made, allowed Bletchley Park to break into Enigma fairly early and continue breaking it right to the end of the war. But how were the German operators supposed to use it, and what were the mistakes they made? The Germans had what were called key sheets, and these were sheets divided into the various days of the month, and opposite each date were the settings that they were supposed to put on Enigma. It would tell them which 3 rotors out of the 5 that the machine was supplied with they were supposed to pick, what the ground setting for each rotor was, i.e. which 3 letters were showing in the top, what the ring setting was around the rotors, and what the plug board settings were. Now, before they sent a message, once they got the machine set up, they had to send what was called an indicator. And this was to tell whoever was receiving the message how to reset his Enigma machine in order to decode the message. So he had to choose 3 letters at random from the keyboard. Now let's just say for this argument we choose QWE. He would input that twice. It was a double encryption. And what came out on the panel on the top, let's say, was ABCDEF. This was the indicator. The operator would then reset his rotors to QWE, and he would then type in the message. And the radio operator would send the indicator and the message to whoever was receiving it. And the first thing the recipient would do was to look at the indicator, ABCDEF in this example. He would key that in, and what would come out on the top panel was QWE, QWE, because Enigma decoded as well as encoded. He would then set his rotors to QWE, and he would then type in the coded message, and what came out on the panel was the string of letters that spelled out the original German message in clear or plain text. Now, he was supposed to choose 3 keys at random, that the German operators got lazy, and they would actually choose something like QWE or ZUI or QAY. Some operators would even choose 3 A's or 3 B's or the first 3 letters of their wife or their girlfriend's name. The weather ships that the Germans had out in the North Atlantic and the North Sea, when they sent their reports back to base, would begin them, weather report. Many of the operators finished off their messages with Heil Hitler. And all of these stupid mistakes British intelligence latched onto. And they used that, plus their knowledge of the fact that Enigma never coded a letter as itself, in order to break into Enigma. And they carried on breaking it continuously. But it was no easy matter, because the one thing you have to remember is that with all the variations on this machine, the order of the rotors, which rotor to pick out of the 5, the ring settings, the plug board settings, what the code breakers were faced with was a machine that could code a letter in any one of 158 million ways. With all of these complications, therefore, it didn't take the code breakers long to realize that breaking Enigma by hand every day using paper and pen was just not viable. It took too long and there were too many messages to break. So it was obvious that some sort of machinery was required. Because don't forget, on an average day at Bletchley Park, the code breakers could have been breaking anything between 2,000 and 6,000 messages. And that was German, Italian, Japanese, and hand ciphers as well. But as far as Enigma was concerned, we needed some machinery. And that is when Alan Turing had rather a good idea. And that idea is what we'll be looking at in the next part. It didn't take Turing long to realise that trying to break Enigma with paper and pencil took far too long. He needed a piece of machinery to do it. So he conceived an idea. He took that idea down to the British Tabulating Machine Company in Letchworth in Hertfordshire, and he talked to the chief research scientist there, Harold Keane. And what Keane came up with was this machine. This was called a Bombe machine. And it consisted primarily of a whole series of drums. These were to emulate the rotors on Enigma, the fast, the middle, and the slow rotor. There were 12 of them in this direction, 3 rows, so we have essentially here 36 Enigma machines all opened out and connected in series. And over here we have the plug board emulator. This would normally live behind this machine. This is not actually a working model. This was a replica that was made for the 2001 film Enigma. Very good film, by the way. If you haven't seen it, see it. So, how did this machine work? What used to happen was that after midnight, when the German operators changed all their settings on Enigma, the messages came in here to Bletchley Park. And what the code breakers did was to look at those messages. Now, by experience and what they'd already had through from intelligence, they worked out what was called a crib. Now, a crib was the best guess that they could make as to what part of that original message meant. From that crib, they could make up a menu. This is an example of a menu. This is a very simple one, but there were ones that were far more complicated than this. This doesn't tell us very much, but to a bombe operator, this tells that operator how to set the drums on the machine and how to plug up the plug board. So given that menu, what the bombe operator would do was to go to the machine and she would set the first 3 drums according to the menu. Each drum then was set one setting past that first one. She would then plug up the plug board according to the menu. and she would then switch the machine on. But this is the clever bit of Turing's idea. He knew that if you had to go through every single combination of the rotors on Enigma, that could take some considerable time, because the first thing we had to break was the indicator. Once we'd broken that, then we could break the message. And it was the indicator that we were making the attack on. So he thought in reverse. He thought if we can have a machine that can discount all of the combinations that can't work, what you're left with is a very few that may work. And out of those, there's probably going to be one that will work. And that, on an electronic piece of equipment, is a lot quicker than going through every single combination to see if it works. Turing was actually thinking in reverse. So once the machine had been plugged up, the operator would switch it on, and if the crib was good and the menu was good, maybe within 5 minutes the machine would stop, a bell would ring, and the operator would then look to see what letters were indicated on these 3 drums here. And she had a checking machine. So what she would do is put those settings onto the checking machine plus what was indicated by the plug board. And she would feed into the checking machine A. And if what came out was J, she'd then feed in J. And if V came out, she'd feed in V. And if P came out, she knew that setting was reasonably good. So what she would then do is to give those drum settings and the plug board settings over to another operator which worked here in the bomb room. And she was working on what was called a Letchworth Enigma. And that was a British coding machine that was set up to emulate Enigma, rotors and plug board. And she would set up the rotors as per the drum settings. She would set up the plug board as per the plug board settings. And she would then feed in the coded message. And providing the crib was good, the menu was good, those settings were good, what came out on her machine was the original message in German in clear or in plain text. If what came out of her machine was gibberish, then obviously what the machine had come up with was not good, which meant that the crib and the menu were not good. It went back to the code breakers and they redid it and tried again. And over a period of time, with their experience and the mistakes that the Germans made, the code breakers got very, very good at guessing these cribs and getting the menus right. And throughout most of the war, they were breaking Enigma on a very regular basis. But Enigma is only really one story here at Bletchley Park. There was another story that was equally important. Although it didn't lead to as many decrypts, the decrypts that it did lead to were just as important, if not more important. Because that story concerns the coding machine that Hitler and the High Command used. And that's the story of Lorenz. And that's where we're going in the next part. In 1940, Hitler decided that he wanted his own coding machine that he could use to talk to his generals and all the members of the High Command without the rest of the German military knowing what he was saying. So he decided to go to the Lorenz company to see what they could come up with. And what they came up with was this. This is the Lorenz SZ42. And unlike Enigma, which worked on 3 or 4 rotors, this actually works on 12 rotors. And around each rotor are a series of switches, 501 in total. And unlike Enigma, this didn't work on a 26-letter alphabet substitution code. this actually worked on a 32 character teleprinter code, or as it was known, Baudot code. And these switches were very important because these formed the patterns on the rotors, and the patterns determined which obscuring characters were pulled in to form the code. What are obscuring characters? Well, in order to understand that, we have to understand how Lorenz worked. And to understand that, then we have to go back to a little bit of basic theory. In 1917, a man called Gilbert Vernown was working for AT&T Bell Laboratories in America, and he was working on a stream cipher for teleprinters. Now, as we've seen with the Lorenz machine, the teleprinter works on Baudot code, and this is a representation of Baudot code. We have 26 letters of the alphabet. Some of those have got duplicate functions, but in addition to those, we've got extra characters like carriage return, line feed, etc. And each character has got 5 data bits, and we can represent these by zeros and ones. And this is where teleprinter code, of course, varies from the code that Enigma used, which was simply a 26-letter alphabet substitution code. So what was Vernown's system? Well, the first thing he did was to make up this matrix. And this matrix consisted of purely randomly generated teleprinter characters. Once this matrix had been achieved, and this by the way was called a pad, once this had been achieved, all of those characters could then be transferred onto punched tape, and the tape could be put into the teleprinter machine. So how did it code? Well, let's say that I've got to send a message to my friend Sam. The tape is in the machine, ready with all the obscuring characters, those generated characters from the matrix. I key in S, which has got those 5 data bits. The machine then pulls in the first character off the tape, which is B, and that acts as an obscuring character, because when we add those 5 data bits to those 5 data bits using the magic of modulo 2 addition, which is the same as the XOR function in logic, you finish up with those 5 data bits, which represents N. I then key in A, which has those 5 data bits. The second character is pulled in from the tape, which is that. Add the 2 together, you get that, which is W. I then key in M, the third character is pulled in, add the 2 together, you get L. And then I key in the rest of the message. So what I've done is to key in SAN plus a message in clear, and what comes out is MWL plus a whole string of characters that look like complete gibberish. And the beauty of this is that this encoded message is absolutely unbreakable, because there's nothing in that message that indicates which obscuring characters were used. But that is only true under 2 specific circumstances. And that is, number 1, this pad of characters is purely randomly generated. And the second circumstance is that it's only used once for one message. If you want to send a second message and encode that message, you have to produce a completely different pad of obscuring characters. And that's why this is called a one-time pad. So, Lorenz had a problem. They knew of Vernown's work. But how do you put all of these Lorenz machines out into the field with a whole stack of tapes and ensure that all those tapes are used in the same order, sender to recipient, they don't get damaged, they don't get broken? It's impossible to police. And that's where Lorenz came up with a very clever idea of having those switches around the rotors, which we saw earlier, 501 of them. And those switches formed the obscuring characters. However, there's always a however. No machine can generate purely random characters. It has to work on how it's programmed. So the characters that Lorenz was producing were pseudo-random. And fortunately for us, the code breakers, they were more pseudo than random. How did we break it? Well, we did. And the way we broke it was relying on the mathematical skills of John Tiltman, Bill Tutt, Max Newman, and just a teeny weeny little bit of help from the Germans.
What you're listening to there is not Morse code, it's Baudot code. The problem is that we can't do anything with that immediately. So it's got to go through another piece of machinery, which is this. This is called an undulator. And this produces a paper tape. Now we set up a special listening station at Knockholt in Kent, near the south coast of England, to listen to these signals. And they were picking these signals up since 1940. They were coming into Knockholt, they were producing those tapes, and this is what a tape actually looks like. That's the trace formed by that signal. Now we had people here at the park who could actually interpret that and interpret the characters from that. They would then make a list of the characters. Those characters could be then punched up on tape, and then we could go on to the next part of the process. What we're going to see in the next part is how we broke Lorenz initially, and then we'll be looking at the machinery that helped us break Lorenz right through to the end of the war. Our listening station at Knockholt was picking up these Baudot-coded messages right throughout 1940 and 41. And they were coming in here to the park and across the desk of Colonel John Tiltman, who also knew all about Van Em's work. But the problem was that he also knew how difficult they were to break. What he ideally needed was for a German operator to send the same message twice on the same Lorenz settings and make lots of mistakes in one of the messages. Well, what were the chances of that happening? Well, on the 30th of August 1941, a German operator had to send a message. We think he was working on the Athens to Vienna link of the High Command. He set his Lorenz machine, exactly as he should, and he sent the message. All 4,000 characters of it. I reckon it probably took him best part of an hour. And then he sat back for a rest. He very quickly got a message back, words to the effect of, sorry, didn't quite get all of that. Please send again. Well, you can imagine how he felt. He probably wasn't very pleased. His fingers were probably sore. But he knew he had to send the message again. And he did. And that's when he let the rest of the world know about the two catastrophic mistakes he'd just made. With Enigma, the settings were changed usually at midnight and kept for the following 24 hours. But with Lorenz, the settings had to be changed for each message. Now, this particular operator has probably been told that what he's got here is the latest state-of-the-art, completely unbreakable machine. So he must have thought to himself, 12 rotors, 501 switches, forget it. What he did was, he reset his Lorenz machine back to exactly the same start position that he used for the first message. Mistake number one. Mistake number two, he decided that as he keyed in the message, he'd abbreviate it. Now, the first word from the message was Spruck Nummer, message number. In the first message, he typed that out in full. In the second message, he got as far as Spruck N and then realized that he could abbreviate Nummer to NR, which he did. And then he abbreviated all the way down the rest of the message. Now, Knockholt intercepted these two messages. They didn't know what they meant, but they realized that they were important, because here they had two messages with exactly the same indicator
because like Enigma, the operator had to send an indicator first. The first 7 characters in each message were exactly the same, the coded version of Sprook N, and the second message was 500 characters shorter. So it came up here to Bletchley Park and across the desk of John Tiltman. And what John Tiltman did was he took one look at those messages and he knew exactly what the operator had done. And this was his heaven-sent opportunity. And over the next 2 weeks, using his own mathematical skills, he completely extracted the entire string of obscuring characters that we used for those 2 messages. But the problem was that we didn't have anybody here immediately who could do anything with it. But we then got a new guy join the research team. His name was Bill Tutt. He was actually a chemistry graduate, but he had one abiding passion, and that was statistical mathematics. So the head of research gave him the 2 messages, gave him the key and said, see what you can do with it. So he went away, started work. 2 months later, he came back and he said, well, I can't tell you what it's called, I can't tell you what it looks like, but I can tell you how it works. In fact, what Bill and his team had done was to actually work out that this machine, whatever it was, had 12 wheels. 1 bank of 5, which we call the K wheels, 1 bank of 5, which we call the S wheels, and a bank of 2, which we call the M wheels. They also worked out that the K wheels all moved independently and incrementally. The S wheels all moved together, sometimes moved, sometimes didn't, and the M wheels were the 2 drive or pin wheels. They also worked out that the K wheels introduced 1 obscuring character and the S wheels introduced another obscuring character. In fact, what Bill Tutt and his team had done was to work out the entire logic of Lorenz, which was quite amazing because we never even saw a Lorenz machine here at the park until the very end of the war. In fact, one writer who picked up on this some 30 years later described it as probably the greatest intellectual feat of World War II. So now we had a methodology for breaking Lorenz, but the only problem was it took far too long. We needed some machinery to do it. So we went down to the post office research establishment at Dollis Hill, just outside of London. And what they came up with was this machine here. Now we didn't know what Lorenz was called, so we codenamed it Tunny. And the messages that Tunny was creating we called fish codes. So this was, in effect, our own Tunny machine. It was a Tunny emulator. Now, it doesn't look very much like the German Lorenz machine, but it does essentially the same job. And in the next part, we'll be looking at how the Tunny machine works, and we'll also be looking at the other piece of machinery that we need in order to break Lorenz quickly. This is the Tunny machine that was made for us by Post Office Research. It consists of a whole bank of uniselectors, relays, valves, etc., and 24 rows of plug sockets. And all of these plug sockets are arranged in 12 pairs. The top row in each pair can be plugged up with the wheel patterns from Lorenz, and the bottom row in each pair is plugged up with the wheel position. So we can do that with all 12 wheels, all 12 pairs of these plug sockets. Once that's done, we then switch the machine on. And what the machine has done is it's now initialized. In other words, it has set itself to exactly the same patterns and positions that the Lorenz machine had for the message that we're going to decode. That message would be punched up on a long piece of tape and it would be put into this section here, and on the teleprinter out came the original German message in clear or plain text.
But there was one tiny snag. In order to do that, we needed to know what the patterns and the positions were in the first place. Now we could calculate that out using Built-Up's methodology, but the only problem was that depending upon the length of the message, that could take anything up to 6 weeks, because don't forget the mathematics involved in this are extremely complex. And by the time we'd worked that out and decoded the message, that message was probably dead and buried and long gone. So we needed another piece of machinery to help us get those patterns and positions quickly. And this is where Max Newman got involved. He was one of the great mathematicians that worked here, and he was the head of what was laughingly called the Newmanry. That was a hut that was set up purely to look at electromechanical means of breaking Lorenz. So using Built-Up's methodology, Max Newman worked out a mathematical model that would give us what we wanted. And he then went down to TRE, the Telecommunications Research Establishment at Malvern in Worcestershire. And he saw a guy there called Charles Wynne Williams. And what Wynne Williams came up with was the design for another machine, which is this machine here. Now, I don't know how humour translates to different countries, but in the UK during the war, there was a very famous cartoon character called Heath Robinson. And what Heath Robinson did was to make incredibly complicated machines to do incredibly simple jobs. And when this machine came up to Bletchley Park, the operators took one look at it and said, well, that's Heath Robinson to start with. What it actually does is it works on 2 paper tapes. There was a reading head, a whole selection of switches, valves, uniselectors, and a readout. And the idea was that one paper tape would be punched up with the actual coded message and then formed into a loop and put on one side of the machine. The second tape was then punched up with some of the wheel patterns that we'd worked out quite laboriously longhand. That was then formed into a loop and put onto the other side of the machine. The 2 tapes were then started from the same start point and run through the reading head. And what this machine did was to compare those 2 data streams using what was called double delta cross-correlation. And it teased out of those 2 data streams the pattern and the position for the first Lorenz wheel. The machine was then stopped and the tapes were then put 1 character out of register and then run through the machine again. And it repeated the process. It teased out the patterns and the position for the second Lorenz wheel, and so on until we had the 5 K-wheel positions. Once we had those, we can work out the other 7 relatively quickly. But Robinson had a few problems. The tape feed was friction, and the tapes kept slipping and going out of register, so we had to stop, reset, and start again. Using paper tapes, the paper would stretch very slightly, so we had to stop, reset, start again. Sometimes a tape would break, a new tape had to be punched up, start again. It was relatively slow. The reading head was reading characters at 1,000 per second, and there was no printout on this machine, it was a readout. So that required the operators to be stood by the readout, scribbling madly as figures flashed in front of them. But when it did work, it proved that Max Newman's mathematics were absolutely correct. But what we needed was something quicker and a lot more reliable. Now at this point, Alan Turing said to Max Newman, I think I know somebody who might be able to help. He works for Post Office Research. He's a very, very bright electronics engineer. His name's Tommy Flowers. Why don't you go and see him? So Max Newman did. He went down to Post Office Research, he saw Tommy, explained what the problem was, explained the mathematics behind it. Tommy started with a blank piece of paper, and the solution he came up with was quite staggering. Because what Tommy designed was the world's first semi-programmable electronic digital computer. It was called Colossus. We have one here. It lives next door. And that's where we're going next. Until Tommy Flowers designed Colossus, the most complex piece of calculating equipment we were using had around 150 thermionic valves, or vacuum tubes, but the original Mark I Colossus had 1,500 valves. The powers that be here at Bletchley Park were convinced it wouldn't work because they believed that valves were far too unreliable. But, fortunately for us, Tommy knew a great deal more about valves than they did. The other great contribution that Tommy made was that he figured out the wheel patterns of Lorenz could actually be calculated internally within the machine if he included a memory circuit and thyrotron rings, thyrotrons being a particular type of valve, and this completely eliminated the second paper tape that Robinson needed, thus solving the synchronization problem. Timing problems were also solved by tiny holes that were perforated down the length of the tape, so Colossus could read these and set its clock speed from them. But it wasn't just a matter of putting a punched tape on the machine and the right answer coming out at the other end. A tape was punched up with the coded message and formed into a loop. It was then loaded onto this section of the machine, fondly known as the bedstead. It then passed through the reading head here at a linear speed of nearly 30 miles an hour, reading characters at 5,000 per second, 5 times faster than Robinson. But Colossus didn't use a stored program. It used a switched program. So the operators had a flowchart that showed them how to set the machine for each part of the operation. The first thing they had to do was to set the data switches using these levers. They then moved over to the logic circuits where the switches were set according to the information on their flowcharts. Next to the logic circuits were the plug boards where the trial wheel start positions could also be set. Colossus then started reading the data streams on the tape and did a count of the number of occurrences of a particular Boolean function. The machine worked using Boolean mathematics, essentially ones and zeros. This bank of decade counters would then keep track of the count and output this information to these display counters that were calibrated in thousands, hundreds, tens and units. When the maximum count had been achieved, the operator would flick a switch and that information was output to the teleprinter, the information being the patterns and position of the first Lorenz wheel. The operator would then change the program by resetting the logic circuit switches and jack plugs according to the information on her flowchart, and a second count would be made. When that reached a maximum value, it was output to the teleprinter, and that was the patterns and position for the second Lorenz wheel. This procedure was followed until we had all the requisite information for all 12 wheels. Tunny would then be plugged up with these settings, and the tape from Colossus was then put through Tunny and the original German message in clear obtained. The length of time it took to obtain all 12 patterns and positions varied tremendously depending upon the original coded message. It could take as little as 20 minutes or as long as 8 hours. The average was usually between 3 and 4 hours. The first Mark I Colossus arrived here at Bletchley Park in December 1943 and was up and running by February 44. So successful was it that 10 more were ordered, but even whilst the Mark I was being built, Tommy Flower's assistant, Alan Coombs, was working on a Mark II version, which was even more powerful and had 2,500 valves in it. We had 10 Mark IIs working at the park by the end of the war, with the 11th still in production, and the original Mark I having been converted to a Mark II. The very first Mark II was installed on the 1st of June 1944, 5 days before D-Day on the 6th, and just in time for us to break some messages that proved Hitler had been fooled by all the misinformation that we'd been putting out about a huge army in the southeast of England, hundreds of tanks and planes, and phantom convoys that would be sailing across the Channel to mount the invasion at the Pas de Calais, whilst Normandy was just going to be used as a diversion. Many of his generals didn't actually believe this information, but Hitler did, and that was all that mattered. And the rest, as they say, is history. What you're looking at here are just a few of the 2,500 valves that the Mark II machine has, and this particular rebuild of the Mark II is actually on the footprint of Colossus number 9 that was in this room during the war. The fact that we have that Mark II Colossus working here at all is down to the dedication and the hard work of Tony Sale and his rebuild team. Tony started in 1992 to rebuild Colossus, but he had very, very scant information. The parts of 3 circuit diagrams, literally a handful of pictures, and a few notebooks from some of the original engineers. But Tommy Flowers was still alive, as was Dr. Arnold Lynch, the man who designed the reading head on both Robinson and Colossus. So they all got together, virtually reverse engineered Colossus from the bits of the information that they had, and then rebuilt it. And 14 years later, we see the rebuilt Mark II. And to prove that it worked, in November of 2007, Tony Sale set up what was called the Cypher Challenge. We took our Lorenz machine from the museum here to the Heinz Nixdorf Museum in Paderborn in Germany. And there a message was coded up and broadcast over the airwaves. And the challenge was intercept that message and break it. So we received it here at the park, we punched up the tape, we put it through Colossus, we got the patterns and the positions for the rotors, we then put it through the Tunny machine and decoded the message. Total time that took about 3.5 hours, the same as it did during wartime. So then we sat back and we thought, right, let's see if anybody can beat that. And did they? Oh yes. And who was it? A German. His name was Joachim, and he lived in Bonn, just round the corner from Paderborn. He did have 2 big advantages, though. Number 1 was that he was a software engineer, and he actually wrote the programs that he needed to do that task in ADA, high-level computer language. He also had the advantages of using the latest Pentium-powered computers. In fact, he did it in the fastest time, and when he came over here to Bletchley Park to collect his prize, he did point out that whilst Colossus was reading the characters at 5,000 per second, his computers were crunching numbers at the rate of 1.2 million per second. He also worked out that in 1944, Colossus was actually working faster than many of the computers that were being designed 20 to 30 years later. And I think that says an awful lot for the genius of Tommy Flowers' original design on the Mark I and Alan Coombs' design work on the Mark II. And in the final part of these videos, we were looking to see what happened when hostilities finally ceased in 1945. Almost forgot. Joachim's time to break the message? 47 seconds. Just think what we might have achieved here if the chips that we'd had available to us in 1944 had been Pentium instead of just potato? Oh yes. At the end of the war, Churchill decreed that everything here at Bletchley Park had to be destroyed. All the paperwork and the records were burned, and all the machines were broken up into pieces, as Churchill said, no bigger than a man's hand. And he put blanket secrecy over everything that had happened here. And the reason for that was perfectly obvious. We told the Russians that we'd broken Enigma, but we hadn't told them and had no intentions of telling them that we'd broken Lorenz. The Russians were allowed to come in through East Germany and meet the Western Allies in Berlin. In fact, it was Churchill that coined that very well-known phrase, "an iron curtain has descended over Europe," because he was very astute and he knew that when the hot war finished, the Cold War would begin. He also guessed that as the Russians came in through East Germany, they may well pick up some Lorenz machines. And if they did, and they thought that we'd never broken Lorenz, they might start using those for their own coded messages. And if they did, then Churchill wanted the intelligence services to be able to intercept those messages and break them. So 2 Colossus machines did actually escape the breakup, and they eventually finished up at the successor to GC&CS, which was GCHQ, the Government Communications Headquarters based at Cheltenham down in Gloucestershire. Those machines, as far as we know, were working until around about 1960, when they were finally decommissioned, broken up, and all the records destroyed. So that really leaves us with the staff that worked here. Where did they all go? Well, many of them went back into the jobs that they had before the war started. Many of the academics went back into academia. Colonel John Tiltman, who by the end of the war was now a brigadier, he went to America and he worked for the NSA, the National Security Agency, on a consultancy basis. And he was eventually inducted into their Hall of Fame, one of the few non-Americans ever to get that distinction. Gordon Welshman, he went to America as well, and he worked in the secure communications industry. Bill Tutt, he went to Canada, and he went first of all to the University of Toronto, and then to Waterloo University, where he set up a brand new maths department to study combinatorics and optimization. And that department actually became one of the best in the world in those subjects. Max Newman, he went up to Manchester University, and he worked on the Manchester Baby and then the Manchester One computers, 2 of the first computers to use stored programs. And that really left Turing, who was possibly the biggest enigma of them all. He left the park in 1943 and he went over to America to help them with their 4-rotor bomb machine design. He came back to Britain and worked for the National Physical Laboratory for some time, and then he was tempted to go up to Manchester University to work with Max Newman. But in the early 50s, something happened that was not only to change Turing's life, but to probably change the course of history. In the early 50s, the house where Turing was staying was actually broken into. And when the police came to do all their interviews and forensics and whatnot, he actually admitted that he was having an affair with a friend of the person who burgled the house. And this really shows Turing's rather naive, unworldly side, because he didn't see anything wrong with that. The problem was that friend was another man, because Turing was gay. And here in the UK, in the 40s and 50s, being gay was illegal. You could get prosecuted for it. And indeed, Turing was. He was taken to court for indecency. He was found guilty. And he was given a choice, either 1 year in jail or 1 year taking female hormones, which was, I suppose, their answer in those days to this particular problem. He opted for the hormones. But a relatively normal male taking female hormones has some rather unfortunate side effects. His weight started to balloon, and here we're talking about someone who was a great athlete. In fact, he would have been in the British Olympic team in 1948, running the marathon, had not injury prevented him. He also became, of course, extremely depressed. And one morning in around about June 1954, his housekeeper came in and found him dead in bed. And on a table elsewhere in the room, there was a partially eaten apple laced with cyanide. The official cause of death was suicide. But what a legacy he left. Many historians have argued and discussed since that time what Turing might have achieved, considering what he did achieve in those just mere 41 years before his death. In fact, I've read somewhere that some historians said that Turing could well have been the precursor to Bill Gates. Who knows? We don't know. We'll never know. And perhaps it's best left that way. But down through the years, he's become known as the father
of modern computing science. There are about 6 or 7 science parks and science departments named after him, statues of him. He's even had a road system named after him. So I think in hindsight it's really not a bad legacy to leave. But I think to myself that it would have been nice if Tommy Flowers, say, had been honoured in the same way. Yes, when everything about Bletchley Park came out into the public domain, he did receive an MBE for the work that he did. But I've always thought that to name a road system after Tommy, where he was born and raised, would have been very, very nice. Because I think Flowers Way sounds so much nicer than the M25 motorway. Will it ever happen? Well, who knows? I rather think not, and I think that would be a very great shame.
Historians have discussed Bletchley Park ever since the end of the war, and they've generally come to the conclusion that the work that was done here probably shortened the war by around 2 years, and in the process saved not just hundreds of thousands, but probably millions of lives on all sides. If you've been watching this series of videos, you've probably realised that there is a huge story to tell here at the park, and all we've been able to do is literally scratch the surface. Many of the descriptions of the machinery, for example, have by necessity been fairly simplistic. The only real way to fully appreciate the enormity of the task that faced the code breakers, and indeed the enormity of the solutions they came up with, is, if at all possible, pay a visit here. But I'd like to leave the last word to Britain's greatest wartime leader. In late 1940, Winston Churchill made a speech in which he coined what was to become one of his most famous sayings. And he used that saying to describe the pilots of the Royal Air Force's Fighter Command when they were pitted against the might of the German Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain, a time when Britain truly did stand alone. And I've often thought to myself, as I walk around the park and I think about what happened here and I think what was achieved here, I become more and more convinced that that saying could just as easily have applied to the men and women who worked here. All of those unsung heroes who, because of the secrecy that was imposed upon Bletchley Park, the rest of the world never even knew about for over 30 years. The code breakers of Bletchley Park.